Well, good afternoon and welcome to the annual Trinity College Divinity Association's conference. It is a real privilege to have all of you here today, and we are thrilled by the response, and we're excited by your participation, and we're excited by the topic itself, and we're excited by our speakers. Just as we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which Trinity College and the University of Toronto operate is part of the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and Anishinaabe people, land covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge the stewardship of this land by First Nations, the continuing presence here of Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and the harm caused by colonialism. We commit ourselves to seeking a new and honorable relationship with the first people of this land. Dean Britton, fellow alumni and friends, it is my honor and pleasure as the chair of the Trinity College Divinity Association Executive to welcome everyone to this virtual presentation this afternoon. Annually, the Trinity College Divinity Association Executive organize a conference to further our engagement and outreach of our alumni, the Anglican community, and beyond. Typically, as we know, a session like today's would be part of an in-person conference at the college. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has dictated otherwise. I think it is safe to say the pandemic has impacted everyone around the globe. We have all learned to adapt and continue to engage in new ways. Today's event will include 4 presentations, a mix of pre-recorded and live, from 4 guest presenters and a live question and answer to follow. I will moderate the question and answer following the presentations, and I invite you to submit your questions via chat throughout the event this afternoon. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible following the presentation. I encourage all of you to adjust your Zoom view to speaker view and ensure your volume is properly adjusted and that you remain muted for the duration of this event. Please note, this event will be recorded and will be available to view again at a later time. I also want to extend an invitation to all attendees today to join us for the Trinity College Evensong tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. Following this event, you will receive an email with the Zoom details, inviting you to attend tomorrow's Evensong led by the Humphreys chaplain, Andrea Budgie, and with special guest preacher, Dean Ansley Tucker, and with music curated by Trinity's organ scholar, Nick Veltmeyer. The service will include readings, prayers, and reflection. Before I introduce our next speaker, I would like to offer a prayer. If we could just still our bodies, quiet our minds, and come together. Loving God, we do give thanks for our college, Trinity. We give thanks for its place in the formation of Christian leaders. We give thanks for its place within the Anglican communion. We ask that your Spirit be with us today. Guide our ears as we listen. Guide our speakers as they reflect with us, and guide our discussion as we reflect. We pray this all in Christ's name. Amen. Now it is my distinct pleasure to invite the Reverend Dr. Christopher Britton, Dean of Divinity, and Margaret E. Fleck Chair in Anglican Studies at Trinity College, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Darcy. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Faculty of Divinity and Trinity College here in the University of Toronto, we thank you for joining us today. It's wonderful to see so many of you participating in today's event from all over Canada, the United States, and beyond. I don't think I need to elaborate on the significance of the topic. Like all churches, throughout the world, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on church life, as well as the rest of society, has been substantial, and I think we're still wrestling to understand how this has shaped us, and both in the present, but also going forward into the future. But clearly, the impact on regular church life, from our worship, our community, our social outreach, our pastoral care, and perhaps even our understanding of ourselves, our sacraments, and the nature of our mission has been impacted in many ways. And so I'm delighted that we have four panelist guests today who will speak to us, who each offer a unique perspective from their area of expertise on what they've observed as we've been living together through this. So without further ado, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce each of our guest speakers. The Most Reverend Mark Mcdonald is an alumnus of Wycliffe College in the University of Toronto, and this month was conferred an honorary degree of Doctor of Divinity from Trinity College. Prior to this, he completed a degree in Religious Studies and Psychology at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota, and did postgraduate studies at Luther Northwestern Theological Seminary in Minneapolis. Archbishop Mark served as a priest in Ontario and various parts of the United States, becoming Bishop of Alaska in 1997, and then National Anglican Indigenous Bishop, and now Archbishop, of the Anglican Church of Canada in 2007. He is president of the World Council of Churches for North America. He served on and contributed to several important collections, such as The Green Shoots Out of the Dry Ground, Growing a New Future for the Church in Canada, and The Gospel After Christendom, New Voices, New Cultures, New Expressions. The Reverend Dr. Eileen Scully was raised in the parish of St. John the Evangelist in Kitchener and pursued theological studies at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto with an MA in Systematic Theology, including a thesis on the unity of God and love of neighbor in the theology of Karl Rahner, and a PhD in Systematic Theology, focusing on the development of the theology of grace and theological anthropology. Eileen has worked as Associate Secretary for Faith and Witness with the Canadian Council of Churches for 6 years, involved in a multilateral ecumenical dialogues and national interfaith dialogues. In 2001, she was hired by the General Synod of the Anglican Church of Canada to serve as coordinator for worship and ministry. In 2009, becoming director for that department. In this capacity, she manages various aspects of our shared life, including formation and liturgical development. Recently, she helped curate a national Anglican network of healthcare, spiritual care professionals. The Very Reverend Ansley Tucker has been serving as rector of Christ Church Cathedral in Victoria and Dean of British Columbia since 2015. Prior to that, she was an archdeacon in the Diocese of Calgary and rector of Christ Church in Calgary. Following nursing studies at the University of Ottawa, she completed divinity studies at Trinity College in Toronto in the 1970s, a time of significant shifts in almost all aspects of church life, including its liturgy. It'll be interesting to note if there are parallels between that era of recent church history and our present societal moment. In addition to her Master of Divinity, Ansley completed a master's degree in systematic theology while serving as tutor in theology for first-year MDiv students at Trinity. Over the last 40 years, Ansley has held various leadership roles related to doctrine and worship, including chairing the Doctrine and Worship Committee in the Diocese of Toronto during the Book of Alternative Services introduction. While parishes she has served have grown in terms of measurables, Ansley believes that it is the immeasurables that drive the measurables. If we are clear about a compelling vision for what it means to be a Christian, the rest will follow. The Reverend Garfield Wu was born in mainland China, where he lived for over 30 years, having sensed a calling around the age of 12 years old to ministry. In China, he worked as an engineer, project manager, and entrepreneur, and eventually moved to Canada, where he studied at Trinity College. He was ordained in the Diocese of Niagara in 2018. Garfield is serving as rector of St. Luke's Anglican Church in Palermo near Oakville. He's also Anglican Chinese missioner in the Oakville area and beyond. I'm delighted that we have each of these speakers today and grateful to them for participating in this event. Thank you all for being here. and we look forward to the live Q&A following these presentations. As Darcy mentioned, please feel free to submit your questions to the event via chat. We'll now begin with our first presentation by Archbishop Mark Mcdonald.
Bonjour, Nindinawe. I greet you in the language of this area where I am, and I greet you in a respectful way as relatives. I'm going to speak about the way that Indigenous people have innovated and adapted to some of the changes related to the pandemic, and I'm going to help us understand some things also that have probably been hidden in plain sight for good reason, I think, as you will see this unfold. I want to caution you at the beginning that people from the dominant culture in North America will find it difficult to see things in Indigenous cultures because the dominant culture tends to see things from a point of view that diminishes Indigenous experience or tends to see it as a reflection of its own culture in a primitive sense. This is often served Indigenous means and protection because they've been able to hide things in plain sight. So for instance, we'll talk about gospel jamborees. When dominant culture people hear about that, particularly sophisticated dominant culture people, they think, well, hootenanny or fourth grade Bible camp, that sort of thing, and they oftentimes miss what is happening in those kinds of transactions. I hope that you'll see some greater depth and complexity in these sorts of things. The first thing that I want to talk about is some of the aspects and technology that we've been dealing with in light of the pandemic. In the Anglican Church of Canada, we have roughly 225 churches and church communities, mostly in the north, but some are in reserves that you'll find close to the Canadian-U.S. border. Most of our churches are in fly-in communities. Many of these communities are quite small, and a lot of them have been quite severely shut down, locked down because of the pandemic. Many of our communities, and we're in touch with them almost on a daily basis. Many of them have been in under the direction of their pandemic committees, and have been for ever since the pandemic started. And they've had varying degrees of shutdown or availability of church gathering, and this has created conditions that we'll speak a little bit more about in a moment. What has happened is that many of these communities have been using radio, which is a very important aspect of life in these communities. So church services in many of our 225 reserved communities have put weekly Bible studies, prayer meetings, and Sunday worship on radio. Some communities, particularly in the Arctic, have used Facebook, and some have used YouTube in the same way. Lots of communities have used both. The internet is variable in these communities, and some of the communities which has which have good internet have elders who aren't able to use that well, so they still prefer the radio, and so this you found in a lot of different areas. Zoom is being used by our office to do Canada-wide teachings that involve people in our urban communities. About 60 to 75% of Indigenous people now live in urban areas. A lot of them have connections with reserved communities. They are overwhelmingly poor. Unemployment is a problem, and they're overwhelmingly unchurched. That's a subject for another time, but this is due largely to a lack of ministry on the part of the old line denominations that were their home in reserved communities. But that's another story. We'll talk more, but there's been a use of a mixture of technologies, radio, Facebook, YouTube, and other things by the ministries associated with the office, with my office, the office of the National Indigenous Anglican Archbishop, and we'll talk more about that. But this infrastructure, Zoom and these things, have been adapted to use some very important ministries that we have innovated the technologies that have to use some very important innovations to Anglican liturgy and Anglican approach, and that's what I would like to shift to now. Philip Jenkins has written a book on the popularity of indigenous spirituality. He describes it as the most popular and fastest growing spirituality in the world right now. And it is difficult in light of that for most dominant culture people to remember that in the United States and in Canada, it was illegal to practice that spirituality until the 1960s, both in the United States and in Canada. Stony Mountain, which many Canadians would be familiar with, was built primarily to provide a place to house medicine men for practicing the things that now many dominant culture people would like to be involved with, and sweat lodge, Sundance, these type of things. So a person could be in great trouble if they practice these things. It is particularly important to understand that church people, the Anglican Church in particular, were involved in promoting this kind of approach, this severe approach to indigenous religious practice. It is a little bizarre at this point now to have Anglican clerics, wondering why some indigenous people are reluctant to practice these things now. It needs to be said that indigenous people found ways to incorporate the cosmology, the essence of their practice in other ways. So, as was true with the African American religious practice and Christianity, we see a similar kind of process, a very different result, but a similar kind of process where indigenous cosmology and the essential ideas go underground in music and prayer and a number of other ways, and we'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. And you see them emerging in some ways that begin to flower in a number of creative and I think quite wonderful ways. Now, these things were well hidden to most of the missionaries. I'm not saying the missionaries liked them. The missionaries encouraged indigenous people to mimic, in the Anglican case, mimic specifically English forms and practices of worship relating to the Book of Common Prayer, to hymn singing, and that sort of thing, and they oftentimes tried to suppress these things that developed among indigenous people. At times even accusing indigenous people of things like syncretism and worrying about the ongoing influence of indigenous ideas. I want to say that it's important to understand that the ongoing presence of indigenous cosmology, ideas, principles, values, should not convince someone that there wasn't a very sincere and wholehearted embrace of a robust Christology and a very sincere appreciation of biblical Christianity and I would say also a very profound appreciation of things like the Book of Common Prayer. And if I may say so, a more sacramental understanding of the baptism and the Eucharist, oftentimes a much more deep understanding of those things than the missionaries who taught them about them. But you see, again, this was placed within the context of their own way of seeing things and believing things. So it was the Word made flesh. It was this reality becoming firmly enfleshed in their worldview. This had to be, as I said, hidden in many ways. And the way we see it taking place fundamentally and primarily is in hymn singing. We see very early on the practice of hymn singing developing in a basic form that is quite rugged, different languages, of course, but a pattern, a gathering somewhere towards the end of a work day, a sharing of food, especially in the early days. The people were quite poor, and the value of sharing, the idea of poverty, didn't exist among indigenous people. They didn't have a word for it because sharing was so much a part of indigenous life that it was unknown. And so they came together and they shared what they had, and they kept everybody alive in that way. And then after the food was shared and everyone was fed, then they would begin singing, and they would alternate songs in their language with most often translated by one of their own, and sung slowly at first, so that elders could pick them up. alternating with stories, testimonials of God's action in their lives, of sometimes stories, traditional stories, disguised as disguised from the missionaries, prayers, quite funny stories, communication back and forth. These would often last until the sun came up in the morning. They would be associated with happy occasions, with sad occasions. They took the place of things that were outlawed, dances and other kinds of celebrations. As we see in other parts of the world where there's conflict, they were under quite a bit of military supervision much of the time, and so the only time they could gather together was for these church-supervised things, and this allowed them to share in their own language deep aspects of their faith, while they explored out loud and in their own way of thinking, and because they tended to think theologically through music, they began to explore this new spiritual and theological universe that they were in. They had the spiritual and theological sophistication to understand that what the missionaries were telling them and what they were beginning to understand through their own approach and appreciation of the Scripture, these were two different universes. And they began to share, and I'll mention this in just a minute, through their own development of their own ministries. They began to share these things directly to each other, and this pattern of hymn singing begins to spread. We find it preceding Western missionaries all over, and this practice, which begins on the East Coast of the United States, begins to spread all over North America. Now, I don't know much about what happened in Central America. I do know a lot about what happened in the South, from the United States down to the Southwest, and I know quite a bit about Canada and the Arctic and Alaska, where I ran into hymnals and hymns that had been translated by Robert Mcdonald from his Ojibwe hymnal that came from the same area where I grew up in, and was brought all the way up to Alaska, and some of the hymns and hymn texts that I was familiar with, you could see how they were related to the Gwich'in hymns that were up there. You can see this practice. The basic shape of it is found all the way from the East Coast of the United States, all the way up to Alaska, all the way north to the top of the Arctic, and the area around Winnipeg, that central area becomes a kind of a spreading place for these things. Now, so I need to spread out now and get to the present. These basic things were then put in the hands of lay ministers who were sometimes called catechists, sometimes were given titles like, were given a kind of ordained capacity, sometimes they were deacons, most often catechists, sometimes lay readers and other things. Sometimes they had no recognition by the church at all, but they spread all the way across, oftentimes going, preceding the Western Church. The reality is that the church, looking for funding, wasn't really anxious to tell the story of the indigenous people who beat them there. And so we're just beginning to learn this story now. Why it is significant now is that their methods and their ideas have informed many of the practices that have developed during this pandemic time. There's so many that I can't talk about them all. But the things that I was speaking about in terms of the radio programming that you find in local areas, which are kind of weaving together of the hymn-singing tradition and the Book of Common Prayer. By the way, the Book of Common Prayer that they're using is the usually is the 1662 translated into their local language. And then hymn singing practices that have grown up out of the hymn singing tradition, whatever it might be called in their local area. In some local areas, they use guitars. In some areas, like where I grew up, they don't use any instruments at all. In some areas, they use harmony and four-part harmony and that sort of thing. Where I grew up, they sing with just the melody. In most parts of Canada, however, they use electric instruments amplification, and Nashville has had some impact on how they do it. The same basic shape of the gospel jamborees, as they're called throughout most of Canada, is the same basic shape that we find in the early 1800s in the first documented cases of this hymn singing tradition in the East Coast of the United States. But again, this has had such a profound impact. You'll find it in non-pandemic times, very popular throughout all these areas. What we have done is that we have taken it and we have put it on, first we tried it live and through YouTube, and then we live stream over YouTube, and we found that just got messy. So we pre-record the MC, and we get all the musical pieces, mostly Indigenous from across Canada, but we get parts from Maoris and pieces from Australia, a number of non-Indigenous parts. We pull them all together through the magic of the Anglican video, the help of the communication department of the church house, and with some help from Resources for Mission and a lot of other folks. They all working together with my office and Ginny Doctor from my office. Anyway, they all work together and they pull together this magic, and it is played with a kind of a ticker tape that collects prayers and other things, invites people to donate at a specific time. While it is being put on Facebook, it is then broadcast on radio through Wawate Radio Thunder Bay, which is then broadcast to hundreds of First Nations communities from the James Bay all the way to the border of Manitoba, and then NCI radio throughout most of the First Nations communities throughout Manitoba. This is also in Winnipeg. So we reach thousands of homes across this huge area, and we're going to places where we're the only thing on. We usually do this Saturday nights. We've had 9 gospel jams, and we usually include prayers. We usually have someone preach. Michael Curry from the presiding bishop of the U.S. Has preached for us. He was a big draw. We also, and we have people join us from all over the place. To give you an idea of our audience, we put up a place where you could click to donate, and we had 900 people click at one of our events. Now, 900 people didn't donate, but, that's 900 people thought about it enough to click. So we have quite an audience, and that isn't our main audience. Our main audiences our main audience are all of these mostly Cree, Oji-Cree, Ojibwe, Dene homes across northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, northern Ontario. We hope to expand this in the future. But this is using the innovation of Gospel Jamboree and that idea in doing that. Now, I want you to see that this the dynamism of this really is taking this really very old innovation of Indigenous spirituality, hiding basic Indigenous values and ideals in plain sight in Indigenous in Christian hymns, and doing them in this way. It was it's a very very wonderful thing. But I also want to say that you'll notice also in the way it was expanded through these hymn singing, but also through the lay ministry. These appointed lay ministers who spread this. Now, that's the part that I want to end with. The other thing that has happened is multiple groups across the land. One group devoted to what we call gospel-based discipleship that meets on Zoom 3 days a week. A lay ministers support group that meets once every week. Multiple connecting groups of Indigenous bishops and leaders, the Anglican Council of Indigenous People, and half a dozen more groups from all across Canada, and joining with other groups. They are all connected by this idea that the elders gave us, and that is to meet together, trusting that the Spirit of truth would speak through the people assembled, usually the elders and the young people, and also the ones you expect the least, and will articulate insight that you will need in time of need. And this is one of the fundamentals of Indigenous life, and indeed Indigenous law. And we were slow to grasp onto this idea. Most non-Indigenous people who have experienced it initially will be attracted by the technique, but Indigenous people sometimes initially are attracted by the technique as well. The placing the gospel in the center of the sacred circle, reading the gospel 3 times, asking a different question each time. First question, what stands out for you? The second question, what do you hear God saying? The third question, what is God calling you to do? Oftentimes people are intrigued by the technique, but after a while, for Indigenous people, the really important and big thing is the idea that God shows up. And it is that understanding, that bedrock belief, that is at the heart of Indigenous life, at the heart of Indigenous law, and really at the heart of Indigenous fellowship. And so the elders who were teaching a group of young clergy a long time ago, what was the basis of Indigenous life, educated them to follow this way and to make it the center of Indigenous Christian society. We've made it the centerpiece of Indigenous digital society, and that's been an innovation at the heart of these digital innovations as well. We've tried to bring it into these other things, and we're trying to make it apply in urban settings as well. We've done it in some urban gatherings as well. Epiphany Urban Indigenous Community does it in Winnipeg, for instance. So these are ways that you might say Indigenous innovations have been applied in technological contexts that have been used helpfully in this pandemic to help. And we're really happy to report that Matthew 18:20, that wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them, works digitally as well. So we have observed this as an empirical fact. Anyway, so thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to being part of your gathering in terms of questions and answers, or actually just being a part of it. Take care.
Thank you for the invitation to be part of this gathering. I bring you greetings from Christ Church Cathedral in Victoria, BC, where we worship, work, and play on the unceded ancestral lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, notably of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. In the year before COVID, our cathedral was engaged in an extensive process to define its mission for the middle years of the 21st century. And again, people noted that it was going to be very important for us to leverage technology so that we could expand our reach educationally and in terms of our music programming. But you know, when it came time to come to a focus group to discuss this, only 8 people turned up. Clearly not the highest priority. Well, that was then, and this is now. Now, to be sure, there have always been early adopters. My friend Phil Poole, 20 years ago, had captured front page attention because he put a speakerphone on the altar at Trinity Church in Aurora so the housebound could join in. And then you fast forward another 10 years and another colleague in Calgary had swapped out the missal stand for a flat screen monitor on the altar. And both times, you know, I could see the point, even the advantage, but to tell the truth, it all seemed just a bit tacky to me. And we all know the first rule of Anglican liturgy, thou shalt not be tacky. And don't get me started on the big screens, for which I must say I still have an aversion because they divert people's attention from the action on the altar to the screen over here somewhere. I remember in Calgary seeing this absolutely spectacular font. It was at the back of a church with lots of space around it, capable of accommodating both immersion and pouring. And I was so envious. I said to the rector, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a space where the whole community could gather and be part of the baptism? Well, no. The rector pointed to the overhead cameras, which would capture the visuals and conveniently project them onto a screen at the front of the church for a community which had its back to the action. I suspect that this is a story which is salutary for us because it's a parable about the extent to which technology might or might not be an appropriate replacement for all hands on deck. I mean, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Well, with the arrival of COVID, we have all had to hustle. We've learned a lot fast. In our case, we started by recording short little things on smartphones, and then we moved to pre-records with 2 rented cameras, and then live streaming with the same 2 rented cameras, and now to 7 remotely operated cameras from a single control desk. Now, I guess that you have learned all the same things I have and more, each of us in our own particular context. That includes, of course, the size of our communities, the public health restrictions we're operating with, and our capacity, our financial resources, the expertise, the tech expertise we have at hand, and whether or not we have access to the internet. So for me, all of this has raised a couple of theological issues. The first relates to our ecclesiology. I mean, what is the church? What constitutes authentic Christian community? Those who have grown up as digital natives, wedded to social media, insist that they are engaging in authentic community. The church, by contrast, has insisted that community requires presence, showing up, meeting. Now, make no mistake, in this we are profoundly countercultural. But the thing is that our understanding of church is so deeply embedded in our theology of incarnation and of sacramentality. The very presence of Christ is meted to us in earthly things, in bread and wine and handshakes. And in fact, what people are telling us they miss the most in this time is people, the sense of genuine connection. And so the question is, what does it mean for us to find our principal identity as an ungathered community? Will this prolonged separation from each other go any distance towards teaching us that being in the world was where Jesus would have had us in the first place? That liturgy is inherently missional. And then the second theological issue relates to our liturgical practice. And whether a worshiper is singing her heart out or sitting in contemplative adoration, good liturgy requires the engagement of everyone who has come. How can we accomplish that digitally when the service can so easily be little more than something that you're watching on TV? And I do think that we may need to rebalance our view of the liturgy as something which normally speaks for itself, sweeps you up in its mystery, and the need for liturgical leaders to stay out of the way with their idiosyncrasies and their folksy charm. Who of a certain age does not remember Howard Buckner decrying the use of liturgical stage directions? Our opening hymn this morning, if it's our first hymn, it is the opening hymn, and if it's a hymn, it's a hymn, is hymn number 203, found in your hymn book. Surprise, surprise. But perhaps without the idiotic redundancies, right now, this is exactly the kind of intervention that is needed if we're going to turn a virtual audience into engaged participants, interacting with people in another space. So I want to show you a couple of examples. First, the Dean of Canterbury, Robert Willis, he has become the rock star of online worship, famously sitting in his deanery garden each day with the chickens and the pigs and stringing out morning prayer over a half hour or so. So I have here a 3.5-minute clip from May the 10th. Have a look.
Good morning and welcome on this Monday, the 10th of May, to the Deanery at Canterbury Cathedral. Here in the garden, we've come on a Monday morning to the walled garden, where we, as a garden congregation, have been planting a wildflower garden. We've seen how well the apple trees are in bloom this year, having been aerated by the way in which the pigs have turned over the land and given air and water a chance with the roots below, and done great good, much better than any rotavator, and much better than the work of one or two gardeners would have done. But then you saw how bare the earth grew around from what they had done, and also the patience we needed when the garden was first sown with flowers and grass seed and no rain came. Well, patience has been rewarded with the rain, and we've had more rain in the night, and you will see this morning how gradually a green sward of grass and also of little flower plants of various different types of wild flowers are beginning to sprout and will become more recognizable. But it's a lovely thing to see in this morning air, and at the moment the rain clouds have gone and I'm able to sit here with no wind at all and the sound of the chickens who are kept away from the sprouting grass and seedlings for the moment, because they would make short work of them. But bring your own intentions and prayers here on this Monday morning in Eastertide. Now, this is also a Rogation Day, as is tomorrow and Wednesday, the 3 days leading up to Ascension Day, when we ask God's blessing upon the work of the world and humanity's engagement with that world in so many ways. And today we will be thinking in the collect of Rogation for not so much rural things, but for industry and for commerce. And again, the way in which humanity engages sensitively with the life of this planet and the creative's power that the Creator has caused to be within the planet, within plants and creatures and soils, and also within humanity, working in partnership with the Creator in this way. Well, here we are this morning with patchy ground, a bit like the parable of the sower, for the seeds have fallen in different directions, and I think that we're going to find that we shall see little patches of bare earth and patches of green as it grows up. We're thinking this morning, here's Leo arrived, here you are, little boy. We're thinking this morning of some areas of sad violence. In Jerusalem itself, we pray for the peace of Jerusalem, as Psalm 122 says, as the tensions there burst into violence, and we pray for all there at this time and those trying to restore the balance of peace there. We pray for...
What is it that people appreciate about this? I think it's the informality, this apparent stream of consciousness, the sense he's talking right to you. You know, there's not that much prayer, but there's a lot of commentary on the readings, and there's always this well-researched segment on this day in history. The informality, which is so appreciated, though, is a combination of spontaneity, feeding Leo the cat, dear boy, and this studied casualness. Notice, for example, that the teapot is never used. Our learning, you can't just wing the kind of informality that engages people. And I also note that when it comes to Sunday worship, Canterbury Cathedral is just about as formal as it gets. Now for a second example, completely different, short segment from a weekly offering for children. Meet Herbert the Turtle.
Welcome to Christ Church Cathedral Sunlight. We are coming out of Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, for the Festival of Pentecost, with Herbert the Turtle and Kate Newman.
All right, I got my very special trusty fire extinguisher ready to go. I know all about the story of Pentecost, and I'm not going to let any fire get in the way of me telling the story of Pentecost.
Herbert, what are you talking about?
I'm talking about the fires of Pentecost here, Kate Newman. And I got a fire extinguisher ready to go so they don't get out of control.
Herbert, the fires of Pentecost aren't like normal fires. They're sort of poetic fires. They're fires that burn but don't hurt. They're a way of saying that the power of God's love is like a warmth of a fire.
Oh, wait. Are you trying to tell me that I can't use my fire extinguisher?
In today's story, we hear about the Holy Spirit. It is written, all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. The Holy Spirit, then, is understanding. The Holy Spirit brings us together. We can understand one another beyond distance, and when we do, that's the presence of the Holy Spirit. We can understand one another, sometimes beyond language, and when we do, that's the presence of the Holy Spirit. We can understand one another beyond all the differences in our lives. This is the Holy Spirit.
Now, do you notice that in this example, there is nothing left to chance? It is a tightly constructed, pre-recorded piece with high production values and aimed at a specific audience. And just while we're on the topic, that's probably the best way to deal with children online. They're not going to sit still for live-streamed prayers of the people. Let's move on and just have a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of the platforms we are commonly using. We'll start with Zoom or Google GoToMeeting, any one of those meeting apps. Advantages: you can set it up from anywhere. You don't need anything more than a computer and an internet connection. You don't even need to get dressed from the waist down. Unlike pre-recordings or live stream, you can actually see who else is in the room. So it feels like a gathering of real people. And that means that people tend to have more sense of actually engaging or having skin in the game. Also, there's a chat function, which allows things like prayer requests and also the kind of chit-chat that goes on, you know it does, in Zoom meetings, which feels normal to people. And then finally, the share screen function also makes it possible to import words to hymns or other files. There are disadvantages. You know you can't sing or pray aloud together because of all the feedback. Setting up in your living room is convenient, but people do miss their church buildings. They do miss the ambiance of church. It does work better for groups that are smaller than 25 because that's the number you can easily get on your monitor. And not everybody, especially in our demographic, is particularly comfortable with the technology. So what about pre-recorded services? This does allow people to see their space and to hear music being sung or played. It's fairly easy for the digital immigrant to access. They just need to know where to click on their website. It allows a video editor, and that means that you can integrate disparate components into the service. Maybe somebody leading the prayers from home, which is pre-recorded, or a guest preacher from someplace. It also allows the service to be recorded in shifts. So if you have to limit the number of people who can be present in the space at any one time, you're able to do that and create a seamless whole. Because it's pre-recorded, you can make mistakes and try again. And many say that that leads to less stress and potentially higher production values. And finally, it's possible for your editor to insert lyrics and other signpost information in the liturgy. Disadvantages? Our experience has been that from the leader's point of view, pre-recording feels performative rather than worshipful. And that's especially true when the recording is a pastiche of component bits. You don't go through the liturgy from beginning to end. I mean, if you make a mistake on Sunday, you practice instant forgiveness and get on to the next thing. And it's a lot of work for the video editor. What about live streaming? Well, for us, this has certainly felt more engaged. People at home feel like they're taking part in something which is actually happening. On a platform like Facebook Live, it allows for chat during the service, which is good. And when it's over, it's over. No need for post-video editing.
Of course, there are disadvantages too. If something goes wrong, you're hooped. You need to have a strong internet signal. And you really do need one or more skilled operators who understand the flow of liturgy so they can have the camera in the right place at the right time and who can troubleshoot tech problems on the spot.
We've learned a lot of little things along the way. I'm calling them a baker's dozen of observations, wisdom gleaned the hard way. And here they are. 1, the liturgy can become the servant of the camera, and the cameraman can become the de facto MC of the liturgy. We're dealing with camera angles, shadows. It's important to work closely with your tech team to ensure they understand why you want things to unfold in a certain way so that they can become part of the solution. 2, when you're hosting online worship, remember that your audio enhancement is for the folks at home. We've often had this experience where everything sounded swell in the church, but it was impossible for poor Mrs. Pennyfeathers to hear on her tablet. Helps to have somebody with a set of noise-canceling headphones who can monitor and adjust the sound as necessary. 3, it's also helpful if you can provide access to the text of anthems and hymns, especially if these are sung in a different language, just as we would with a print leaflet. If people can't understand the words, it really doesn't matter how appropriate they are for the occasion. 4, length. Keep it short. This is not some captive audience whose cell phones have been turned off. The kids are going to squall, the dog is going to bark, the dryer is going to buzz, and people can only stay glued to a screen for so long. Average adult attention span these days, 8 seconds. 5, silence does not play well online, sadly. Partly because it looks like somebody forgot their part, and partly because the kids, the dog, and the dryer never got the memo. 6, so now, just when you're getting to the point where you wonder if it's really worth it, remind yourself that right now, people are practicing their faith at home. That's good. 7, please make sure you know what your copyright licensing service covers. That goes for images, printing and performance of music, and text, including the Bible, and the posting and retention of files on your website. Don't get caught. We did. 8, during this pandemic, for most of us, our doors are closed. Jason Moore says, your website is your new front door. All the same rules apply. Make sure people know which door to come in. Don't make them try 2 or 3 places on your website. This may be a good time to expand and rethink our ministry of gathering and hospitality. When people log on, make sure there's something for them to see that suggests they've come to the right place at the right time. It's sort of like turning on the lights before the 8 o'clock service in the dead of winter. And that could be anything from some announcements to a pre-service chat. Some have suggested a role for, we'll call them cyber sidespeople, people welcoming the newcomers, answering questions. And if you're running into technical difficulties, for heaven's sake, just put up a slide that tells people to hang on. 9, if you're live streaming, please do post your live stream for viewing later. These days, it's all about video on demand. I actually wish I could make it pay-per-view. I think that most are discovering that there's as much or more uptake in the week following Sunday as there was on Sunday itself. And here's the thing, we have long complained that people are all tied up on Sundays. You don't come to church anymore. We may just have chanced upon a solution. 10, who's going to do all this stuff? And that's a really good question. This work requires considerable, competent leadership, and we need to think about how we're going to provide it so we don't burn out the people who are carrying the load right now. 11, money. Thank heavens for the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, but we're not going to be able to feed at the public trough forever. We also know that we have now many friends and supporters who aren't likely to turn up in our pews once this is all over. And that's a problem when your business plan is to pass the hat. We're going to need to exploit all the technology and messaging we can if we're going to remain sustainable. If you want to see a shameless plea for support, have a look at the website of the Washington National Cathedral. I know that we all think that technology is a tool in our hand, under our control, to be used by us in the service of liturgy, but it is almost certainly going to act upon us in the long run. We're not going back. Online worship is with us to stay, and the new normal is going to be some kind of hybrid, what some in the business community are calling phygital, physical and digital. And that said, I am seeing a couple of developments that I think warrant our attention. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I think we need to have a look. And so here we are, 12, liturgical tourism. This is the habit that many have developed of dropping in on other churches, sometimes many on a Sunday or even a world away. This can be good, breaking open our rather myopic view of Anglican worship, and especially for clergy, because generally we don't get out much on Sundays. But at the same time, I wonder if this is going to have an impact on people's allegiance to a particular Christian community and on our experience as a cohesive community of believers. And finally, number 13, liturgical grazing. That's the practice of pressing fast forward through the bits of the liturgy that are of less interest to me. I do it. I'll go straight for the sermon or the anthem or the prayers. So there's a question, are there parts of the liturgy that should be packaged for later use? Or is this in fact a phenomenon which is a critique of our current level of engagement in the congregational or repetitive parts of the liturgy? I don't know the answer to these questions, but I think they deserve a good hard look. I also think it's time for me to stop talking, because you need to hear from Eileen Scully and Archbishop Mark. Thanks for your time.
Hello. I'm Eileen Scully, and welcome to my living room. I am recording this video on the Haldimand Tract, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand, and within the territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, grateful for their stewardship of the land and praying for justice and flourishing for all Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. Thank you for the opportunity to reflect on the work that revolved around this book, Eucharistic Practice and Sacramental Theology in Pandemic Times. It is almost a year from the date that I got a green light to go ahead to begin to invite potential writers. The collection of 45 short articles and reflection pieces is available on www.anglican.ca in both individual downloads for each article and as a free ebook. A project like this is about letting those voices speak for themselves, and with that, their own integrity. My own reflections in preparation for today have turned to a bit of a theological so what, posing that not back to the authors so much as to myself, and I suppose generally to the church. What are some of the things that we might need to be paying attention to as we prepare to be able to think about the process of healing from pandemic stresses? Back in March 2020, I received a few questions from clergy, priests mostly, and a couple of bishops, wanting to know if the Faith, Worship and Ministry Committee of General Synod had made any ruling on virtual communion or on private communion or spiritual communion, or on the implications of cessation of in-person worship. Outside of those few asking, there was little will for such conversation. What I heard most often was that it was too soon into pandemic time to talk, and certainly not time to hold theological conversations, and now, as in then, was the time for firm decision and action. We can explore meanings later on. We did, the committee, Faith, Worship and Ministry, eventually receive permission to encourage local conversations about what communities were experiencing. The committee helped to identify approximately 70 people from various vocations across the church to invite to write between 800 and 2,000 words on a topic relating to Eucharistic practice and sacramental theology, using as their jumping off point a question or two that they were facing in their immediate context of ministry and life. This was a very different task than that of curating an academic journal. We weren't defining the writer's questions. It was more like throwing a big dinner party potluck. Those who were able to do so wrote primarily over those summer months and into early October. Many invited did not have the privilege of time or space to contribute and had, understandably, much higher priorities. And I had the privilege, though, of some extra time and of working from home to be able to take it on. I note that is privilege. This was an exercise, then, that is not inclusive statistically or proportionally of all the desired diversity of voices we would want to have had expressed. Those who wrote had the privilege of being able to do so. Indigenous leaders with whom I spoke and listened at length indicated that these just were not their questions and their communities are in crisis, and they are. And I'm delighted to see gospel jamborees and gospel-based discipleship offerings and the wonderful Indigenous leadership serving those communities and beyond in extraordinarily stressful and tragic times. Some brief observations about the contents of the book. First, I saw authors pointing with joy to resources that are down deep in our liturgical and formational Christian safe holds, as it were, that have been a delight for many to draw out and to rediscover. Daily office, of course, services of the word, of course, prayer in the home, the domestic church, as it were. Second, the intimate relationship between liturgy and discipleship, specifically in terms of being a Eucharistic people. Being church that can't gather to celebrate Eucharist, but we can be Christ's body, and we are being poured out for the world. Not always articulated in exactly those words, but there nonetheless. A distinctively missional and justice-oriented sense of discipleship, which I find a welcome shift. This Eucharistic body has been so burdened and so busy and so stressed and in so much pain and grief, responding to urgent crises of body, mind, and faith, that we are going to need time to grieve properly, to breathe deeply again. And we're going to have to do that while still binding up the wounds of those injured through ongoing systemic injustices and racism in our society and church. My fear is that just as many in church leadership, myself included, got busier and busier, disproving any sense of lockdown, perhaps offering some kind of Sabbath respite, we'll go from one frantic busyness into yet another in the coming months and years. And we'll be doing that precisely when we need to take time to reflect on what we've been learning, whether we know it or not, about ourselves, God, and what it is to follow Jesus right here and right now. And we need to do soul work. I encourage us to do soul work around Eucharistic mysticism. Karl Rahner said famously about 40 years ago that the Christian of the future will be a mystic or not be at all. The mystic is, fundamentally, one whose desires are compelled by yearning for God in the hope of all creation's reconciliation in God. I would suggest that we do well to cultivate that sense of the mystic. Some of us are doing that, perhaps being driven to do so as we find ourselves reaching for the spiritual sustenance that we need in our own isolation. I am seeing far more social media expressed interest in early church doctors, hermits, of course, mystics of all eras, from the Cappadocians to the Cistercians to Evelyn Underhill to Merton. In those witnesses, we see lives of profound practical mysticism. I say practical because the deepest mystical connection is, of course, that which weaves seamlessly the threads of love of God and love of neighbor, foretaste of heaven with feeding of the hungry, and an unquenchable desire for communion with God that it is a desire for communion with God that is at one with the unquenchable desire to do justice with mercy, kindness, and humility. How do we see our yearning for Eucharistic worship right now? Born of absence, I hear longings to gather, of course, for all the good things we normally do together, praying and singing together, the comfort of liturgy, the regularity of worship gatherings, the spiritually profound, important needs expressed of desire to be nurtured and nourished by God. I've also heard some agitating for, I guess, what we could call pickup consecrated elements. I think it would be very interesting to do a study about spiritual desire during pandemic. What is at the heart of what people are yearning for? I don't think I'm alone about being curious when the desire expressed is very specifically and near exclusively about ingesting elements. Something that could be solved by DoorDash, perhaps, that kind of delivery, the sort of thing we sophisticated types post jokes about on social media. And I'm not being dismissive here. I've heard expressions of what I can only describe as sighs too deep for words. And I do not dismiss out of hand at all even these yearnings that seem unsophisticated. I want to look inside them and invite out their deeper meanings. But I worry deeply about the ways we've overlooked the power of cultural individualism and the tendency to reify, to make a thing out of, and thereby flatten a Eucharistic piety into something less than a vibrant Eucharistic spirituality that longs for union, communion, reconciliation with God and with all creation in Christ. The liturgy of the Holy Eucharist is itself a mystical whole that unites our gathering, engaging the word of God in Scripture, our praise, confession, petition, and lament, anamnesis, and the holy meal, and our being sent out to be the body of Christ in the world. The Eucharist is not reducible to any of its parts, but is a drawing together of different sorts of ritual movements and words and action, each of which depends upon the other. What is our confession if we've not been confronted by the light of Scripture, showing our actions for what they are? What is eating the bread of heaven if we haven't gathered in the hungry for the feast? What is feasting on the word if we are not sent well, blessed to bring good news and real food and healing to the world? We know this. What is the catechetical ritual formative work we need to do to grow the sense of unity and interdependence of the different parts of our Eucharistic liturgy so that we don't suffer a sort of utilitarian deconstruction of its parts? Kenneth Leach reminds us that in the symbolism of the liturgy, we are caught up and into mysteries beyond the power of words. The mysteries of death and rebirth, he says, of dust and glory, of darkness and light. He says, the symbols speak to us more powerfully than words because they are not explanation and they cannot be understood. They, he says, swallow us whole and we become a part of them. If we catch something of that splendor beyond words, he says, we have made some progress. To capture that splendor beyond words, we do well to cultivate the eschatological imagination of the mystic, one that is otherworldly in its ability to imagine the new creation God is calling us to be, precisely so that it can put our brains and muscles to work in worldly new creation ways. Particularly when we are burdened down in the demands and fears and sufferings in Chronos, and the dominant societal way of coping with these demands and fears and the weight of it all is through any form of escapism that the world can devise, most of those things being unhealthy and perpetuating of social injustices. We need, I think, Kairos-shaped souls to burst in with heavenly force. I encourage us all to also do some soul work to recall the ground of sacramentality. From those who have access to trees and wilderness or even cultivated parks and backyards, we hear renewed or reaffirmed connections with other living parts of God's creation. And those who don't, who are imprisoned in concrete towers, yearn for green. We may have known it previously, intellectually, that the trees are the earth's lungs. But it feels to me like we're all breathing in more deeply and intentionally when we are in green and blue spaces these days. How are we connecting those little or profound moving experiences to our life in God? Beyond wellness exercises and all the good that comes from paying attention to creation, are we tapping these moments to feed the Eucharistic spirituality, our souls, to feed a Eucharistic spirituality? Do our souls yearn for trees and animals and grasses to breathe free of pollution and destruction brought by greed, and to truly desire clean water to flow like a mighty river of justice that the prophets compel through us? A touch of Kenneth Leach again. It's the full quotation. Well, I have my fingers up, it's a quotation. All sacraments derived from the one great sacrament of creation, for the universe is the form in which the beauty of God's mind manifests itself. The sacraments of sun, moon, sea, and earth, bird, and beast are completed by the sacrament of the human person, the image of God. The sacramental principle, the conveying of spirit through matter, runs through the entire universe. So that Teilhard de Chardin, of course, famously was able to speak of the whole earth my altar. Leach's point is that God's activity of creation can be seen as the primordial sacrament of God's activity, God's initiative. It is ex nihilo, entirely God's loving initiative, and it is relationship, so that we are created not for nothing, not for ourselves, not just to be wound up and sent on our way. We are created for relationship with God, for relationship with one another, and with all of creation. We know this. Genesis sings of a sacramental reality in our very origins, spiritual and physical. Beyond this primordial sacramentality, of course, God becomes incarnate, the Christ sacramental initiative of God reaching out to draw us into God's life, and we, graced, foolish, and frail disciples of the incarnate one, are turned as sacraments to the world. We see these patterns in our own Eucharistic prayers, of course, this tracing of the real presence of God in creation, in history, in Jesus, and in our lives in response to God's gifts. There is a Catholicity to the sacramental imagination, in the best sense of the word, as having an inner fullness and wholeness. A fullness in the way that God moves towards us and we move towards God, because God makes it possible to move towards God. And yet, of course, as Williams warns us, sacramentality is not a general principle that the world is full of sacredness. He says, it is the very specific conviction that the world is full of the life of a God whose nature is known in Christ and the Spirit. It's an important distinction. And then, in typical fashion, he goes deeper. A Christian community formed by sacramental worship is, as he says, a community describing itself in a way that is importantly at odds with other sorts of description, either secular or functional ones. We are born into a world of relationships we did not choose, and we know our dependence on others to make ourselves, and we come to God with our fragility, brokenness, and dependence, and that of the world that formed us and for which we have responsibility. To Williams, this is a key to sacramentality. The liturgy of the Eucharist, as he says, tells us that where we habitually are is not, after all, a neutral place, but a place of loss and need. God meets this, our vulnerability and woundedness and sin, and says, "You are my beloved, you are the beginnings of a new creation, I am working. Look, the whole creation is groaning for you to be revealed as the people you truly are." And so the sacramental principle is not about a natural sacredness in all things, but rather can be seen in our sacramental actions in enacting that process of estrangement, of surrender, and of recreation. And so we are recreated to help heal and then recreate the world. That call is compelling, and thank God it is about grace working in us, because we mess it up all the time and have to keep turning back. This is a reality that has me thinking, especially for some reason in these times, of a need to revive an emphasis on the sacramental nature of confession and forgiveness. This really is more like a footnote. Something that involves in a renewal of sacramental nature of confession and forgiveness, something involving more than words and assurance of pardon, but that in ways formed by music and gesture and touch and scent and movement form a deeper sense of the sacramental in our relationships with God and with each other in corporate confession, as, I wonder, perhaps an emerging sacramental re-emphasis perhaps needed in this stage of the life of the Church. I encourage us to think and to do some soul work around materiality and embodiment. Most of us have had the privilege of being able to connect through video conferencing on various devices, and I don't need to rehearse the insights from neuroscience and physiology that indicates that these disembodied ways of communicating with each other are different on our minds and bodies than being in person with one another. And how different it is than being in person either one-on-one or in a meeting or a dinner party or in worship, it matters. Matter matters, bodies matter. Yes, this is getting cliche. Matter matters. Ritual is the offering of our bodies to God. Ceremonial and ritual use of all our senses. I can't remember which early church doctor said this, but that we are not pure spirits, and if our worship is purely spiritual, it is incomplete because only part of us then is being offered. The Eucharist transfigures our relationship with materiality, with matter, with bodies, with stuff. Rowan Williams, of course, puts it well. The Eucharist, he says, hints at the paradox that material things carry their fullest meaning for human minds and bodies, the meaning of God's grace and the common life thus formed, when they are medium of gift, not instruments of control or objects for accumulation. We still need to say, he says, that the moment of relinquishing what is ours is crucial in the Eucharistic process. Can we sit with that image? The image that what we yearn for in worship, in sacrament, is given, but we cannot possess it. It is beyond our possession and is for sharing. How might sitting deeper in that sacramental reality work its way into the rest of my life, both in terms of my own relationship with things, with money, with my own body, and in terms of others' yearnings and needs? To those who haven't read it yet, I highly commend James K.A. Smith's Imagining the Kingdom, Imagining the Kingdom is his book. Imagining the Kingdom, How Worship Works. I commend it for his ability to draw from the neurocognitive and social sciences to remind us that we are always being formed by the meaning-making environments around us, and that putting it both playfully and starkly, he says, the devil has had all the best liturgies. Formation, he reminds us, is about the shaping of our desires, and Christian liturgy takes place in a context in which our desires, whether we know it or not, and even if we resist it, have already been shaped by manipulations of advertising, entertainment, escapism, competitive capitalist drives to always be seeking the new, the improved, or the illusions of the novel. Secular liturgies work well. They, Smith says, recruit our unconscious drives and desires through embodied stories that fuel our imagination and thus ultimately govern our actions. And they can be fueled by principalities and powers. That thinking forms the basis of some important insights about formation I'll visit in a moment, but it also speaks to embodiment. Smith reminds us that we are kinesthetic creatures, and in the ways our bodies take in and perceive, that there is a bodily basis of meaning that primes us to be oriented by story, by the imagination. Contemporary philosophies of action and hermeneutics are attuned to the ways in which our perceptions of any situation or encounter are shaped by what we bring to the encounter, and that perception is already shaped by what we have built up from past encounters, processed bodily through affect and sense before being shaped into meaning. So I don't always act in a certain way just because I have the right notion of how I should act or the right thinking about what to do. How I should be, I know, for example, I should be generous to a person asking for money on the street. And all sorts of things will go into my perception, though. A lot of them emotional response, unconsciously formed cues, all sorts of background things. We all know this. Those shape our responses. Worship, though, works like this. Smith presents, Christian formation is a conversation of the imagination affected by the Spirit who recruits our most fundamental desires by a kind of narrative enchantment, by inviting us narrative animals into a story that seeps into our bones and becomes the orienting background of our being in the world. Our incarnating God continues to meet us where we are, as imaginative creatures of habit. So we are invited into the life of the triune God, and by being invited into that, inhabit concrete rituals and practices that are habitations of the Spirit. As the Son is incarnate, so the Spirit meets us in intangible, embodied practices that are, again, quote from Smith, conduits of the Spirit's transformative power. The Spirit marshals our embodiment in order to rehabituate us to the kingdom of God. Smith offers that we need a sanctification of our perception. That needs to be aesthetic, and it needs to be imaginative. We need to be moved, he says, not merely convinced. It's more about art than science, more about on the order of a poem than a PowerPoint distillation of the data. This is why worship that relies on packaging a message aimed at the intellect, or at least the easy digestion of an idea through argument and didactic reasoning, why it's fairly shallow. For what do we long as parish and community leaders? How are those desires shaped? Is my fear for the future of my fragile community shaping a desire that I can't quite put my finger on, but is satisfied when I see larger and larger numbers on my Facebook live stream Sunday service? What has shaped that relief that I feel, or that satisfaction? How easy is it going to be to come down from what is being formed in disembodied ways, to shift back to ways of living with the sometimes messier stuff of real lives? I encourage us to do some soul work around real presence and relationship. I've been listening to healthcare, spiritual care providers and chaplains for a few years now, and that has heightened my sense of the sacramental nature of real presence, of real persons with each other. And presence, of course, does not just mean being there. It's about the nature of that presence. One of the things that isolation and reliance on video connecting technology and more email has taught us is that these tools can assist relationships, and they can warp relationships. I have very much experienced online contexts where the values of real presence can be felt. I have experienced those, and yet I find it hard. How to truly be with sacramental values of patience, humility, hospitality, grace, waiting on each other, attending to each other fully, receiving one another truly. It's difficult online. It's also damn difficult in person, where you can't turn off the video or avoid a face in a square on the screen, but are confronted with others in their reality, in their need, and at times with our own discomfort with others with whom we are in communion. So much so that it might be tempting to stay online to at least get business done. How many of you heard, can we do parish council online every year? It went so quickly and so smoothly. I don't doubt that this can happen well. And yet each time I'm in a church business meeting, even when punctuated with prayer and music, I'm left with a gaping hole where I can intuit too much unspoken, feelings and perceptions not expressed, and too often a less than full discernment before decisions. At the same time, some of us are rediscovering the daily office and home prayer, learning to pray with our children and spouses, to rediscover the domestic church. And some wonderful parish lay and clergy leaders are encouraging and equipping people living alone and with others to take out a serious share in their own spiritual life through prayer and home worship. Many Anglicans now have, if they didn't have before, a home church corner or shelf, a candle, a Bible, prayer resources, art. This is something quite different than those wonderful, quite wonderful new monastic communities. It's actually something more basic and consonant with the best of all reformations, meeting people where they are at, where they live. What is more close to home and heart than home prayer? However awkward might be our attempts to be spiritually bare with those with whom we live and share faith, however haltingly the so-called self-perceived non-professionals might be with leading a prayer out loud, I would hazard a guess that many Anglicans have not prayed together in intimacy with those whom they love, to except perhaps for grace at meals. That there are seeds of this life growing is astounding and beautiful. As local leaders, don't overlook this gift. and keep nurturing it. It's not a stopgap until we can all be together in the Sunday Holy Eucharist. It's the local Eucharistic community of one or two or a few offering thanks for the real presence of daily bread, for the real presence of God's love in the real mess and stress and grief and delight of real relationships. I encourage us finally to do some soul work and thinking about our formation. What forms and shapes our discipleship? Picking up on some things that have been mentioned already. Gail Ramshaw, wonderful liturgical theologian, Lutheran, speaks about worship and prayer as God prying us open. I'm back to wondering about what sort of liturgical formation happens when we're principally or only online. I think I can relate to Gail's words in my own deep sense of needing to be pried open, and so in the absence of in-person worship, I need to seek out other awes, other causes for my awe to be raised. I confess I find it hard online. There are great moments I've experienced in more than a few of what wonderful sermons, and I'm blessed with a parish priest who is homiletically able to discern and touch soul needs well. But I know my own formation is diminished. I know that I need my own spiritual practice to be formed in the presence of real community. Liturgy develops in us repetitive, communal, embodied practices in embodied histories that become second nature. Practices for which James A.K. Smith resurrects the language of habitus. Yes, it's spiritual practice, but it's always bigger than just me. It's a communal, collective disposition that gets inscribed in me. And the way that inscription happens is through the kinesthetic and the poetic. Smith calls liturgies covert incubators of the imagination because they play on the strings of our aesthetic hearts. They traffic in the dynamics of metaphor. In narrative and drama, they present visions of the new creation that capture our imagination and shape what we love and what we long for and what we yearn for and how we live with others. But of course, we are also being formed by other forces, bigger forces than that. A longer citation from Smith. Hold my hand up for the whole thing. Through vast repertoires of secular liturgies, we are quietly assimilated to the earthly city of disordered loves, governed by self-love in the pursuit of domination. And so we toddle off to church or Bible study week after week, comforting ourselves that we are devoted to the temple of the Lord, without realizing that we spend the rest of the week making bread for idols. We become the kind of people inclined to a sort of low-grade, socially accepted greed, that it makes us remarkably tolerant of inequality and the exploitations of the poor. Or we take for granted a mobile commuting way of life that exploits creation's resources rather than stewards them. We don't know much, and we won't know for some time, but I think we need to be asking the questions of how so much screen time, both in the entertainment and business worlds, in the commercial world, and in the church, how all of that is forming us. Screens and social media, of course, can be used for good. Yes, of course. But how is their form alone shaping us? That's an important question. I worry that there's a too easy embrace of new mediums without a critical view to formation. It's not enough to leave it to the user or think that we can fully baptize a new form of media without redemption, without confronting its lies and the ways it warps us. And warping and lies are happening. There is now a necessary self-consciousness, a self-display and performance pretty much to our everyday lives. In the macro-societal sense, it's a competitive world of self-display, and as Smith quips, it's more about mutual self-display than about common action. He warns us that self-consciousness is paralyzing. I observe social anxiety rising at alarming rates amongst my friends, my kids, my neighbors, all around. And it seems that all are vulnerable to scrutiny and potentially being made fun of. Smith likens it to being both the deer and the headlights. He specifically notices that self-consciousness draws us out of the orienting impulses of our automated pre-consciousness. that unconscious feel for the world that is what shapes our actions. Self-consciousness, Smith argues, compromises our ability to inhabit those habitus, those repeated communal, common life, unconsciously shaped practices that through repeated communal historic patterns form and shape us together. Christian worship, however, is about getting out of ourselves and being met by God and being drawn into God's life. It begins not only with our carefully curated, it begins not with our carefully curated self-display, but with our gathering in need and facing God on whom we depend, being reminded of our dependence and fragility and need in sin and in our need for recreation, for salvation. What a contrast to what unfolds on the screens of social media. In her wonderful little book, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, Susan Beaumont turns upside down and inside out the standard organizational behavioral approaches to congregational development. In liminal times, she says, the church needs to focus on our core, our spiritual identity, our soul. I pray that we may all share in the grace of breathing space to be able to rest in our souls and perhaps to explore some of the sacramental foundations of our common life, food to sustain us through all sorts of next unforeseen tragedies and adventures to come. Thank you for this opportunity to do some deeper reflection than I was able to do this time last year. May it continue in all of us. Thank you.
Well, I know there'll be more formal thank yous later, but I think on behalf of us, I can just say, wow, that was incredible to hear. We're going to now continue with Reverend Garfield Wu, who's going to speak to us about the ministries that he's engaged in. And I have to say, from a personal note, I'm excited to hear what he has to say. At one point, he was a student of mine, and I was his supervising rector when he started off. And I just know from personal experience, he has the heart of a missioner and the heart of an evangelist. So Garfield, we appreciate what you're going to say.
Thank you for the invitation, and thanks for all the patience for staying here, listen to my conversation or sharing for the next couple minutes. I think first of all, I think I would like to please bear me as English is still my second language. If you couldn't hear clearly or get confused, and send some message via the text, via the chat, and let me know. And somehow, it's my English, some people call it Chinglish, has been improved a lot. So since I stepped out of the school, but I think I won't use too much. Somehow it's like this way. It's sometimes I have to think in another language and speak out another way. Yeah. So let's go back to the conversation today. I didn't make any presentation, but I will share some documents or I think the field work with all of you. My sharing is based on the, I think, perspective of a new ministry and a local urban parish by the experience of coping, healing, and regaining the strength in this unexpected long pandemic time. When I was in school, I think in 2017, I chose a course, a reading and research course. It's called Online Church. At that moment, the major reference book is called Click to Save. At that moment, I think we think it's something will happen in 2040. So no one expected it happened so soon. It's become a reality in our church. But I want to share is at the very beginning of the pandemic, I kind of feel the fatal blow for the ministry and our church. Why I said that? Let me share something with you. So I started my ministry officially, ordained, started 2018, started the Chinese Anglican ministry from 2018. And I become the rector of St. Luke's November 2019, and I think a couple months before the pandemic. Before that, we worked hard, and I worked with the Ken and Darcy and all the missional teams. And I will show you something we have done in hard work in 1.5 years. So let me share with you some documents here. So this is our worship. Remember, this is only 1.5 years work, and before that, I think there's only few people in the church. This is a totally newly established service in one parish. You can see. This is one of our worship service.
Garfield.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we are unable to see the video. Oh, it's working now. Sorry.
It's working now? Yeah.
Go ahead.
I want to share all the, all the videos, and there's another one. This is our choir. Just to remember, this is a newly established worship, and also the new congregation established, I think 1.5 years visiting people, outreaching, get connected. And we basically, there's some other exciting things happened. Let me share with you some other things here. I hope you can see my screen. So we have some baptism here, and you can see the baby baptism, and this is another Asian family joining us. And we baptized the 4 people in the river of another our Anglican church. And also we have our Bible study group, and you can see how many young people join us at that moment. So this is a mixed study group. And the choir I already showed you is we had a fantastic choir, and a lot of people, the first time they join the church. And also we have a lot of community events. You can see this is a community event. We gather together and to know each other, and the Chinese girl, play some music instruments, and we gather together, eating and sharing. This is young kids, they have their own concert. And this is a fellowship. This is our seniors group, and this is the baby social. And also we have a special group. It's called English Coffee. We help people to encourage them to practice their more English. And started from this picture from Toronto. I brought this program to the Niagara. So this is our new English Coffee group, getting more people to set their for the first time into the church, to know Anglican tradition, to get to know each other. So this is our local counselor. So this is another English coffee group. And we have a fantastic music group. See how many events we have. Let me share this one. So you can see this is our music group gathering, and there's some workshops and keep gathering people together. This is our music group, some local concert, and there's this is our one of our old mommies. We call it mommy's choir. So this is another music gathering and a lot of local music here. And we have our seniors group. This is our seniors group. And the gathering, they get a lot of people. They came to church for the first time, and they get to know each other, join our Anglican church. This is our worship. You can see the size of. Remember this? We started from almost 1.5 years ago. I think I started from 2 or 3 persons. And we keep gathering all these neighbors and inviting them to join our church. This is a Canon Darcy we prayed before the service. And this is our choir and our service. This is some seniors joining our church. And this is a children's focus. This is our gospel reading. This is Pentecost that year. Bishop Susan visited our church. This is a time of we invited a group invited by Dean Chris. We did one worship in the Trinity College, and also this is a children's pageant. That year is we rounded up 25 families performed a beautiful children's pageant that year. You can see is all this. This is one of. So we also have our youth fellowship. You can see how many youths we have. Let me show you this. We bring the young people and their family together and kind of worship, playing, and getting to know each other. It's a lot of people see it, all these young volunteers join us. So all these young people join us. So why I said it's a fatal blow? Because of at the beginning of the pandemic, the church is closed. This ministry is not deep rooted in the Anglican church yet. So it's we kind of lost 80% of connection because of we cannot use the church space. We cannot use that. And also as I mentioned this, I was appointed as a new rector at the church, and there's a Chinese congregation. They kind of lost, and what are we going to do? We had to stop our worship. And at the very beginning, as you all know, there's some difficult time for us. Some people call it the Wuhan virus. Some people call it the Chinese virus. One kid run to me, told me in the school. The other kids told him, and so God sent plague to your land. So there's a lot of pastoral care issues and the challenges, and how to adjust in this situation, how to adapt in that. And also for the St. Luke's, there's a totally new congregation, and they are waiting for me for new rector and speak not so fluent English, tell them what to do, how to go through this difficult time. You can see the challenges I was facing. I was so stressful, I had the fear of losing everything we built for 1.5 years. And as I mentioned, there's a new parish people are waiting for me. Okay, what are we going to do? So we passed that year, it passed the biggest deficit of that church maybe in the history, and how it's a church basically is empty. We cannot use the church. We lost 80% of our income. So I was so stressful, and that moment is I myself I had it's called shingle for 2 weeks, and the doctor told me it's that because of stress. So, but at the moment I keep praying, and I had to regain the strength, and also I'm very appreciated all encouragement, all the support, and all the guidance from diocese, from all the colleagues and all the friends from still stay there with me. And I think, okay, it's time we need to do something different. This is not what we expected. It won't pass for a couple of months. So we started, okay, regaining this strength, and I thought it should start from myself. So I started from the self-care, doing some exercise, and to be the calm leader of the congregation. And I think in 3 months, I lost, I think almost 40 pounds. I think it become, I feel more energetic, and I did a lot of exercise and running, and also I started the online worship, and I gradually to adapting to all this technology things to try to connect with people, made phone call with all these people, and still training the parish leaders, lay leaders. I believe maybe all the experience that you all had experienced a couple the similar situation, but I feel blessed, and God did respond our prayer, and we kind of going back to the, I wouldn't say going back to the business, and turn on the turning point and then become back. So let me show you something what happened in our church right now. Basically, we moved almost everything back to the online or hybrid pattern. It's online or in-person pattern, and the church keep growing and reconnected a lot of families and friends. So let me show you something what we do here. I hope you can see my screen. Yeah. So our worship. Let's see what's this is our online worship. This is before we update our IT facility, and this is some, you can say, is we gather through the online and connected with people, and because we have limited numbers, we have to do the in-person service. You can see the picture here, and we only allow a few person here, but we still provide the music performance there, and have to wear the masks. And this is one of our girls. You can see our music. So I think this year, at the beginning of this year, we updated our IT facilities as many churches did. And so this is what churches look like. Sometimes I feel myself is like, the cyber celebrity or something. So it's use the light there. You can see. You can see our IT. Yeah. But this way, after this, I think this is right now. Right now, we only in our diocese we only allow 5 person in church in person, and the other person have to be online. So, but we, like I mentioned, there's something we can do. It's like we have in the pandemic time we had our weddings this way, and we have limited person in the church, and all other person is all through online. So I didn't have a picture. We have a beautiful funeral for one of our long-term parishioners, and we have 5 person in church, and 39% online, and we delivered a beautiful funeral service. Our Sunday school also growing. You can see the kids are joining our Sunday school group, and this is a way. I think these kids, they already get used to
so yes, the fruit is the
pattern, and there's a lot of events that they can do. It's through online instructor, and this is the armor of God. The kids made they join the Sunday school. Stewardship, and the stewardship you can say is we use our church space and did a plant sale, curbside plant sale. We raised 7,000. And last Christmas, we did a fundraising event. We raised 100, I think people bought 125 turkeys to send to the neighborhood to help them to pass some families to, pass the Christmas. So this is our, the pandemic time it's called plant sale for supporting our church. Yeah, this is seniors program. Yeah, we still have a seniors program. We started from through the music and connected with the seniors. We provide some, the music. Sorry, she does speak Mandarin. Yeah. And lately is we support our retirement house and the long-term care, and the congregation members make the caps and also the masks sent to to support the staff in the retirement house. Yeah. So this is a similar thing. Yeah, this is a program we do. It's called Food for Life. It's kind of like a local food bank. We started serving before the pandemic. We served 30 families and around that area to pick up food every Thursday afternoon. This program keep growing. In this 1.5 years, right now we are supporting 160 families and 29 seniors. We deliver the food to their home. So we keep getting the support and the local grocery store and all the volunteers to help us and to get the food prepared. So and also Bishop give us some support and all the parishioners to experience this very hard time. And we all know that the neighborhood is. I never thought there were so many people. They needed the food every Thursday, and they lost their job and they couldn't go to the grocery store, locked down, isolated. But this program it's keep growing, keep getting bigger and bigger. You can see it's all the volunteers who join us together. Other community events, we move them to online. You can see sometimes I have 5 or 6 or 7 Zoom meetings a day. So we have a lot of gatherings. Sometimes I had to, so I cannot join you this time. You can see all the music group, fellowship, social group, and news, and all these young kids and different years. Chinese New Year. We spent a different Chinese New Year last year, but I decorated the church. I did some prayer, and I raised, I think, a few $1,000s for this year, and to support this church as a stewardship opportunity. And also our Bible study group, and that is we also moved to the fellowship Bible study. I'll move them to all online. That we keep going. So people still get connected to learn each other, pray each other. So this is basically what I want to share. It's what I would like to say is in this very different time. So I think we have to find our spiritual strengths, and we have to step out of the, it's a kind of going down. So I believe it's in each difficult time, God presents more opportunities. For this new ministry, for this, I think it's a new, kind of for me, it's a new church. Like I mentioned, I felt desperate. I thought, it's a fatal blow. So how are we going to do it? So I thought it's probably I have to run to the diocese office, ask a bishop, you have to support, have to give us more, it's a strength or something. Yes, indeed, the bishop gave us a lot of support and encouragement and all the blessings. But we worked hard together with all the congregation members, with all the people together. Like I mentioned, right now it's St. Luke's is regaining their strengths, and our the PAG number, the donation number is keep going up, and we applied some grant and got approved, and also the Chinese congregation member is kind of. So the Chinese congregation member, I think we already basically reconnected, like I mentioned, we lost 80%, but now I think we connected the 80%, and right now we're getting more people joining us. So we kind of associated with the, lately I did a little bit count, is like 80 to 100 families. And lately we initiate another program, it's called Honor the Aged. So it's originated from the Young Fellowship. I was trying hard to put the young people together to see if we could do something to go through this journey together. But I think it's hard to get these young people to join the church events. But lately we find an opportunity, and we connected with the local, I think it's a retirement house and a long-term care, the places around 30, and we will provide the community service, gather these young people to do volunteers all through online, maybe provide some music programs, maybe provide some, I think therapy or helpful work, and maybe help people do some paperwork, teach the young children to do something. Because of the second generation of Chinese congregation, they all speak good English, but maybe much better than me. But they needed some people to guide them to contribute more to the communities. So, like I mentioned, there's turning curve, and in this ministry right now we kind of passed that pandemic time. No matter the pandemic lasts, or we will go back to our normal life. The hybrid pattern part of the ministry, I think the ministry pattern is more stable now. So it's you have sent me the time is almost close. I think that's basically what I want to share. It's more like a field work, and the last words I want to share is a discipleship. So based on all these connections, all these things, I think it is a 3 stage of our work. One is called community formation. The second one is called mission formation. The third one is called spiritual formation. And we do have a lot of opportunity of discipleship. I'm looking forward to have quite a few baptisms of this year. And thanks to be God. Okay, that's what I share.
Well, thank you, Garfield. I really, really appreciate that. And that was inspiring to hear and inspiring to see. So we are agreed to meet until 3:30, but I do think there's a desire for a little bit of questions. So what I think we could do, if we could get our panel up, if we could move to the question period now, I think that would just make sense. I am not sure if Archbishop Mark will be able to join us. Apparently he's been called off on a pastoral emergency. And I think there's been a few questions that have come in, not a lot. Oh, welcome back, Archbishop. We appreciate that very much. But I think the question that Allison posed is a good one, and I think is a good place if our speakers would weigh in on. I do know that the phrase virtual Eucharist came up more than once, and Allison asked, how does a community that is primarily Eucharistic get changed by being I don't know how to, deracinated from one of our primary sacraments. Eileen has pointed to some virtues of this time to expand our understanding of participating in the sacrament, but still, what does it mean that we have become disincarnate, only presenting ourselves to each other and to God through pixels? So I think if the panel, if they could weigh in on that, that's a good place to begin.
Darcy, are you addressing that to any person in particular here?
That would be one. If anyone on the panel wanted to weigh in, it began with you, Eileen. So why don't you speak?
Okay,
and perhaps the others could give a response. See, that's what happens when you ask questions like that.
Yeah, sorry. And I promise I will speak slowly now that I'm in a live environment. It's a great question, Allison, and I did respond publicly there. And well, with my own questions. And I pointed to some concerns that I have about that in relation to how we are formed, that our Christian formation, when we are not incarnate with each other, that does shape us. The being only in Zoom meetings. And I have to say that I'm someone who has only seen other people other than my husband and my 87-year-old father from a distance of at least 10 meters for the last 15 months. I am isolated at home. Only seeing others in this format does something in your brain. The one thing that I want to pick up from Allison's question, though, is, but still, what does it mean that we are becoming disincarnate, only presenting ourselves to each other and to God through pixels? And I don't think this, I can't imagine this is what Allison would be thinking, that we are only presenting ourselves to God through pixels, but when we are coming together and presenting ourselves to God through pixels, that is problem. Yeah, it does something to us. I keep coming back to the gift of this time for those to whom I've been listening who have been struggling with and discovering what it is to pray at home, what it is to be church in the household, in the family, in this community of 1 or 2 or 6 or 5. And I think, yeah, as I tried to say in my paper, which I will make available in writing to folks, there's something about meeting people where we are, and the fact that God does meet us where we are. That is something to draw forth from this time. That this is no throwaway. Just because there are many, if not most of you in this conference, I think maybe parish priests, it's not to dissuade from the importance of the parish gathering, but there is something happening here about what I will call boldly the domestic church that should be nurtured. And the more we can do that, to dig into, well, how we might support people in their homes in prayer, in personal devotion, in family prayer, in the simplest and most, which means the most profound ways. I think that's not an antidote, but it's the only response that I can think of for my own answer to that question. In my own situation of being only seeing pixelated people most of my days. And yeah, that's where I'm at.
Ansley?
Ideas about this, but what's occurring to me is that Archbishop Mark ministers to a community that very often doesn't have a priest at hand to gather the community in Eucharistic celebration. And I wonder, Archbishop, do you have some wisdom from Indigenous experience for us about this?
Well, yeah, I think that in many respects, the Indigenous people have a lot of experience doing, making do without the physical presence of their most important physical embodiment. And so there is, you try to incarnate, make incarnate the values which they are the essence of those things. So I think that that's what people try to do. They try to do it in in regular feasts and that sort of thing. So find Eucharist in feasts and that sort of thing. But also, I mean, I think that you see a Eucharistic hunger and cherishing of the Eucharist that I think that you would not find anywhere else. I'm going to take this opportunity. I hope you won't mind. I found this in Basil the Great. I don't think we can accuse him of being a liturgical or theological slouch. So Basil the Great said, for myself, I communicate 4 times a week. Who doubts that to partake of life continually is really to have life in abundance? So I communicate on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. On the other days, if there's a commemoration of a martyr, if in times of persecution, individuals under this compulsion give themselves communion with their own hands without the presence of priest or minister, this raises no difficulty, he says. In fact, there is no need to point this out, since long established custom has sanctioned the practice under pressure of circumstances, he says. All the hermits in the desert, when there is no priest, keep the communion at home and give it to themselves. And so there we have a different cosmology and theology operating certainly than we have. So I'm not saying let's do what Basil says. I'm just saying that there's and I would say Indigenous people have that kind of hunger for Eucharist, but they try to embody what they see as the essence of that in their meals. So since they have what I might say is you've all seen those paintings of especially the Ojibwe paintings of the soul of animals and stuff like that. I guess you would call it kind of a Platonic view of things. So you try to receive food in that way, in a Eucharistic or sacramental way. So I think that's the way they deal with it. But there is a deep hunger for actually receiving the body and blood of Christ. I hope that makes sense. Yeah. Eucharistic fast does not make sense in an Indigenous context. Yeah.
Would Ansley or Garfield like to add to that, or can we move on to the next question?
To share a small experience as when we allowed to, a few person came to church, and there's a few people, they wrote to me, we want to go to the church to receive communion. And at the moment of Anglican church are not allowed open, there's a few Catholic church, a few parishioners asked me, can I go to that church to receive the communion? I remember once as one parishioner said she stays home, and I think in the middle of the heaviest time of the pandemic thing. Once we did the virtual communion, I give the blessings, use I didn't touch it, use the sneezer, get the communion, give the blessings through the camera. And after that, she told me, "You don't know how much that means to me." I think people miss the feeling of communion. So I do hope in the future. It's a varies. Some people feel it's I think it's a different through the digital version, but some people still feel it's that spiritual strength and reality there. Yeah.
Thank you. Bishop Johnson brought up something in terms of Indigenous communities and funeral rites and how they are powerful moments of religious life. I don't think that's exclusive to Indigenous communities. I think that's true for many communities. And I would like to expand it beyond just funeral rites, but the pastoral offices in general. If any of you could speak to that from the perspective of the pandemic or post-pandemic age, and perhaps begin with you, Bishop or Archbishop Mark, as you were the first one that this was steered towards.
Yes, so you find a lot of Indigenous communities flirting with breaking the rules, although not, and some actually not flirting, but actually breaking them. But the principle involved here that is important, and I think that in the dominant culture you often hear, well, the funeral is for the family, and the people who are grieving. In the Indigenous culture, you wouldn't hear that. What you would hear is the funerals for the person who's departed. So that what your focus is on the person's passage from this world to the spirit world or to the next world. And so what becomes urgent is that passage from this world to the next, and surrounding that person with prayer and surrounding that person with love and compassion, and not being all focused on fighting and all those sorts of things, so that person will rest in peace. That which used to be, if you look at our prayers, we used to worry about, in the church, we used to worry about that a lot too. But that's really the focus. And so it's not as long as that is attended to, there isn't so much worry and hubbub, but that has to be attended to, or else people are upset. Yeah.
Way in here, I don't think it's pastoral offices that are an issue in this time. It's pastoral care as a whole. Yes, the offices are an issue. For the most part, folks have just been delaying their weddings, and they were living together anyway. Funerals we have been able to do in small numbers or by Zoom. It's something, and it does allow people to participate who probably would not have been able to come from overseas, for instance. But it is a poor substitute for holding each other, and for the sort of ceremonies and rites that make us feel that a life has been lived and we are commending that person into the hands of God. But pastorally, what happens when we can't gather is that what the church does best, which is benevolent gossip, doesn't happen. And so we lose touch with each other. And maybe others have found ways to leverage technology to help with that. But even our phone tree, when lots of people have phone trees, that's old-fashioned technology. People are a little, well, why would I tell you what's going on with my life? You never talked to me before. So what if you're on the pastoral care team? So this has been difficult. It's been difficult when people have been in extremis to visit. We can't here anyway. We've not been able not only to visit people in hospital, but to visit people in their homes. And that's the kind of connection that I think the Eucharist is also about, and the sort of desiccation that we are experiencing on the ground while we are ungathered community. So.
So I'd like to give us 5 more minutes for discussion, and I'd like to turn us to Jerry's question, which I just lost in the chat, but it had to do with the non-liturgical aspect of Christian community, how we gather together from the social to the fundraising, just to those events where we spend time with one another in fellowship. And if you could speak to that, and I'll cut you off at 3:40 and ask Dean Chris to come in and make the final remarks at that moment. And I'll volunteer Eileen, because she's been hasn't spoken in the most recent.
Yeah, this is not I am not a parish priest. I'm a member of a parish and sit in the pews. I'm not even an honorary assistant. So I'm uncomfortable speaking really to the what works, what doesn't. However, one of the things that I am noticing, because I'm a bureaucrat, ecclesiastical civil servant. I spend most of my days in ecclesiastical civil servant related business meetings, church meetings. And so this is meetings, not the social stuff, but meetings also are part of parish life, right? There is parish council, there are choir, meetings, there's everything. Keep it real brief. My one concern is that it's back to my observation that I stated in my paper, that I intuit whenever I'm in these meetings, no matter how we try to brace them, anchor them in prayer and awareness of and commending of the meetings to God and all, there are all the nuanced things that are going on that we are not seeing, we are not taking in, and I am always left with the sense of intuiting things not said, discernment incomplete, and something that in this medium rushes us to make decisions, that is not comfortable in silence, that is not comfortable with sitting with each other, and all those other things that need to happen. So that's not the social stuff, it's the business stuff, but I'm experiencing that in my workplace life, and I worry about it. I'm very concerned about it, decisions made in these times, and I think that applies to parish life as well.
As far as the Eucharist is emblematic of the life of the whole church, it doesn't surprise me that we are feeling these same disconnections outside of the experience of worship. Coming together is emblematically in the Eucharist gathering. Partying together is emblematically sharing a banquet together, gathering around the table, being fed, telling our stories, comforting one another with what we believe. These are all the components of the Eucharist. And so it isn't, I guess for me, this is the thing. It isn't just the Eucharistic rite that we are missing. It's the very reality of being a truly Eucharistic community.
We tried a couple events of like a music night and a dinner night, wine night, getting people together. It's non-liturgical events, but it's kind of we lose a little bit of flavor of that, and also it's hard to organizing people together, because when we see each other in the same space, and it's still different. I think we're on the way of coping that. It's not totally adaptive or any new ideas, but that's right now I think it's our only options. We do try to I think meet sometimes, maybe like Chinese New Year, we have a few people wear masks. We outside of a church, we keep social distance. We had even that we feel I think better than connected only through the digital versions. Just the sharing. So it's I don't have a better solution, but we're trying.
Thank you to everyone. What a wonderful way to end. And I'd invite Dr. Britton at this time for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Ken and Darcy. Well, I have to say I'm very grateful to you all for this discussion today. We've been offered some deep and rich reflections on worship and liturgy in COVID times. And this question and answer period has really demonstrated that we're still trying to understand what the churches have been navigating during this time. Archbishop Mark helped us see connections between the ways in which Indigenous Christians have wove Indigenous spirituality in the Anglican liturgy and how they are now doing the same in online gatherings and in radio broadcasts in innovative ways. Dean Ansley offered us a reflection of the advantages and disadvantages of differing forms of online liturgy and some very insightful principles to keep in mind as we seek to embody studied casualness, which is a lovely phrase. Dr. Eileen drew from a rich range of theological writings to encourage us to reflect not only what we've been longing for in worship and in church during this pandemic, but also to reflect on how these desires are shaped and informed. Our liturgies, she reminds us, are covert incubators of our spiritual desires. And so I'm grateful for the way she added such theological depth to the discussion and also for her work on editing the volume on Anglican liturgy in pandemic times, which I hope you'll have a look at if you haven't already. Finally, Reverend Garfield offered us a view into his missional Mandarin ministry and how he has shifted and adapted this work in the wake of the pandemic. The key role of music in this really stood out for me, I suspect also to you, and how also he found a way to sustain not only this music ministry, but also how he found a way to keep stewardship alive in his community during this time. Archbishop Mark, Dr. Eileen, Dean Ansley, and Reverend Garfield, thank you for your thoughtful presentations and your insights today and for sharing these with us. I'd also like to thank our event organizing committee for helping plan today's event. Matthew Kieswetter, Johan Gimpala, Jerry Mueller, and Darcy Lazert. Thank you for all your efforts. Lastly, later today, you'll receive an email with Zoom details inviting you to attend the special Trinity College Thursday Evensong tomorrow evening, led by the Humphreys chaplain, the Reverend Andrea Budgie, and guests with music curated by Trinity's organ scholar, Nick Beltmeyer. And the service will include readings, prayers, and reflections, and a reflection from Dean Ansley Tucker. On behalf of the Faculty of Divinity, the Divinity Associates Executive, and Trinity College, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and be well.